Hurts has struggled this season relative to expectations, but I do feel that he's still going to have value running the ball. This team is going to get better, and I do think this is a great opportunity to try to take advantage of Jalen Hurts' market while it's still low. David Njoku is now going to be hyper-targeted. He's a talented tight end. Deshaun Watson is limited, so they're going to probably run more plays through their tight ends. This is a great buy low opportunity for David Njoku.
Hurts for A.J. Brown. Oh, he's got it! He's in! All the way for an Eagle touchdown! On a fourth down play.
Winston has nowhere to go.
Winston high, back to the end zone. It is caught, touchdown!
Oh, what a catch.
And that's going to breathe a little life into Cleveland.
Yeah, what a catch.
Njoku.
To Fantasy Football 201. Today's video, we are going to look ahead to week 8. We are going to talk guys to pick up on waivers, drop candidates, buy low candidates, and sell high candidates at each position, just like we've done every week this season. If you comment below in my video, I reply to all commenters, so comment any questions you have about your fantasy football team, and I will answer them. I'm going to help you guys win a fantasy football championship this year. So we have no bye weeks for this upcoming week in week 8, so you don't have to listen to InSync like you did last time. But we are going to talk business decisions. These are guys that are heavily rostered that I would recommend making a difficult business decision and moving on from this player on your fantasy team. Ideally trade them, but if you have to cut them, it may be the right thing to do for your fantasy roster rest of season. So the guys that I'm going to highlight are all at least 90% rostered, but I'm going to talk some other guys as well that are also heavily rostered, maybe in different formats that could be considered as well. So for quarterback, this individual is someone that I've talked about a lot on this show as somebody that is not a dependable fantasy quarterback. And basically every week since week 1, I've recommended to trade him away, and it's Patrick Mahomes. And Mahomes had a very ugly game in terms of his passing performances. He finished the game with no touchdowns passed for. He had 154 yards, 2 interceptions, and he did have a rushing touchdown that saved his game and gave him 12 fantasy points. But on the season, let me read you his numbers for the season, excluding the bye week. He had 15 fantasy points, 291 in that first game. Then he had 12 fantasy points on 151 passing. Then he had 16 fantasy points the next week with 217. And in those 2 weeks, he had 2 passing touchdowns, which is the best that he's had all season. Then the next week, he had 245, 13 fantasy points. He had 331 against New Orleans, which was 13 fantasy points because he didn't have any passing touchdowns. And this week, 154 and only 12 fantasy points. So to recap that, in case you weren't tracking numbers, his max points that he's had this season is 16. That is just not good enough. You look at the quarterbacks on the week for this week. This was a tough week for quarterbacks, but you had guys like Drake Maye, Marcus Mariota, Jared Goff, and Geno Smith, which are all under 55% rostered. In the case of Mariota, mostly unrostered, have a better performance this week than Patrick Mahomes has had all season. This team is heavily injured. This team does not have guys that can separate very well, especially with the Rice injury, Kelsey's age. Now Juju Smith-Schuster is injured and Xavier Worthy is injured. It's just going to be a mess all season. The saving grace that you might have is they play Las Vegas next week, so you can try to convince whoever would be interested in buying Mahomes to take him there. But in one quarterback's leagues, I think that you have to drop this guy because he just simply is hurting your team at this point. And I highly doubt anybody that starts Mahomes consistently has a winning record this season. This is a 2-quarterback mention, but Matthew Stafford has been rostered in a lot of leagues because of the connection with Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp. But if you go through his numbers throughout the season, and granted those guys have been injured, but his numbers have just killed you. He's only gone over 12 fantasy points 3 times this season, and he's only gone over 14 fantasy points once this season. So very similar to Mahomes. If you're in a 2-quarterback league, I don't even think he's rosterable right now. I think maybe when Kupp comes back, things will get better, but I think you have better options out there that you can look at than Matt Stafford. Now let's go to the running back position. And this is another guy that I have been skeptical about throughout the season, but my running back that I would make a business decision to move on with is Rhamondre Stevenson. Rhamondre Stevenson is the most game script dependent running back, and he does have some great games this season, so I will give that to him. But what I mean in terms of a business decision is not to cut him, but to try to trade him away. And because we saw in the game today against Jacksonville, they were playing a good matchup, the 28th best run defense, but New England fell behind in this game, and that pretty much ended Rhamondre Stevenson's effectiveness in this game. Even on that first drive, they were involving Gibson and JaMychal Hasty a little bit as well. I know that he is coming back from injury, but also this team is not a very talented team. They're going to be behind a lot. Rhamondre Stevenson, thankfully for people that own him, he is a top 20 running back on the season. I would be trying to trade him away now for somebody that is not going to fall victim to game script of their team constantly needing to pass, never giving them the opportunity to run the ball and be effective. And then a guy that's over 80% rostered, Zack Moss. I think you can make a business decision and cut him depending on your format because he has easily seeded the backfield now to Chase Brown. Chase Brown has looked far more explosive than Zack Moss, even from the beginning of the season. And now the team is catching on to that and giving Moss the majority of the snap counts and carries. Giving it to Brown, not Zack Moss. So Zack Moss, you could easily move on from now, and I think he's a good cut candidate, if not a trade away candidate. Receivers. So feels a little bit like a cop out here because of an injury that is still unknown. But Brandon Ayuik, to me, I would be trying to get rid of him on my roster. He's struggled this season, and I've defended him that he's talented and he has the ability to have better performances, but the evidence is out there this season through 7 games that he is not reliable. And now he has a knee injury on top of that. He was carted off. Maybe he's going to have hopefully he's okay, and he can get back to playing soon for the player's sake. But in terms of fantasy, even if he does come back at full health, I think you've got to find ways to move on from him because he is hurting your team more than he is helping it. And then a similar player who's heavily rostered but has not been performing well. He's 86% rostered. Jackson Smith-Njigba. So this is a guy that I have liked on this team. He had a productive college career, but fantasy numbers wise, he's just not standing out among Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf. I'll go through his numbers. He started the season with 2 receptions, 3.9 yards. Then New England, he did have that awesome game where he had 16 targets, 12 for 117. But since then, he's just never lived up to that. He's had 6.9 points the next week, 13 the following week. And this is all in PPR, so this is inflated numbers. Against the Giants, he had 13, 10 in San Francisco, and then 5 last week. So he's losing targets. His production is going down. If you're trying to give him a chance, I think if you're in a situation where you need to start cranking out wins, you got to move on from him. Try to find some guys that could be a little more productive for you. And then at tight end, this guy I'm going to talk about a little bit more, but Sam LaPorta. This is another guy that I've defended, but he's just this offense is spreading the ball around, and you're getting up and down performances from guys all over the place, with the exception of the 2 running backs and Amon-Ra St. Brown. Those guys are pretty much locked in, but you saw Jameson Williams struggle today. Another guy I've been saying to sell. Sam LaPorta's volume is just not consummate to the level of player that he is expected to be. And you're not really selling him high, but you are selling him off of name value and hoping with this offense that he could have better performances. I had been trusting him that he's going to work out. This offense is too good, but now I am highly skeptical based on what we've seen through 6 weeks with this team. He has only had as many as 5 targets maximum in a game this season. And that was against the Rams when he was 4 for 45, which was nothing special. He had 1 touchdown this season, which was in that last game against Dallas, but it was on a gadget play and was his only catch and target in that game. Today he had 2 targets with 1 reception for 25 yards. Yeah, this guy is talented, and I like the player. I think he's going to be a productive tight end in the NFL for years to come. But right now, he is not getting the volume to help you in fantasy. And if you're in a situation where you need to start cranking out wins, you've got to find a way to make a business decision and move on from Sam LaPorta. And then Dallas Goedert, another guy that he's had some good games this season, but we've seen now when all the Eagles are back healthy, the tight end gets cut out of the offense. Goedert is dealing with injury. We already saw Devonta Smith lose out on his targets, and he had a rough game today. I know Goedert didn't play, but I'm just saying it's not worth holding on to Dallas Goedert through his injury, because when he comes back, he's not going to get the same target volume as long as A.J. Brown, Saquon, Devontae are all healthy. All right, and hopefully you like this image too, because if you notice in my last video, I had business decisions with Devontae Adams and Antonio Pierce, and now he's on the Jets. So sometimes it works out for guys like that. And Aaron Rodgers continues to pull the strings, although it looks like they're winning right now, so hopefully they'll get back in some good press again. All right, so quarterbacks that you want to pick up this week. So the top 3 guys that I'm looking at, first of all, check if Jared Goff is still out there in your league. Jared Goff has been playing excellent football the past 3 weeks. He, with number 5 quarterback on the week, he's only 48% rostered in 1 quarterback leagues, and it should be higher than that. This is probably the best offense in the NFL, arguably. He is not a running quarterback, so obviously that kind of limits his floor a little bit, but I think if you need consistent play, you can rely on that with somebody like Jared Goff, and you'll be happy with the results. And then a B-grade version of this that I would also consider as well, if he's out there, is Geno Smith, 54% rostered. But very much like Jared Goff, he's been very dependable this season. He's had every game he's exceeded 11 fantasy points. He's also had 4 performances over 17. So that's pretty good for a guy that was not drafted this season and was likely on waivers to start the year. I'll just go through Jared Goff's numbers real quick to compare. He had started off rough this season, but since week 4, and this is not including their bye, 27 against Seattle, 25 against Dallas, and 18 against Minnesota. So if you picked him up, you've been reaping some good results from Jared Goff lately. Also, and this is good. So now we're going to talk some injuries that happened. So 3 big quarterback injuries. 2 of them are not as much fantasy relevant. I'm going to kind of go in order of importance for me. Gardner Minshew, if he's in fact going to be the quarterback, because it looks like Aiden O'Connell broke his thumb in this game. Not going to be a reliable fantasy player, even in 2 quarterback leagues. I'm not very interested in him. Cleveland, I thought it would be Jameis if Deshaun Watson were to get benched, but with Deshaun Watson's Achilles injury that he had in this game, it's looking like it could be Winston or it could be Dorian Thompson-Robinson, but then DTR also had a finger injury in this game, so there's just too much. I wouldn't really chase any of them because I don't know which quarterback it would even be, and this is obviously not a great offense in general. But the one I would be looking at is Marcus Mariota, because Mariota, and this, maybe he may not even start this next week because Jaden Daniels will be good for the next game, which as a Jaden Daniels manager and Commanders fan, I'm hoping for. But Mariota showed you today that he can be effective as in this system. Cliff Kingsbury has designed a very effective system for them to use. He's a mobile quarterback. He gives you some rushing value. If you're in a 2 quarterback league and you own Jaden Daniels, this is a must roster to me, as his handcuff that you hold through the week. But I think he is serviceable even if he doesn't need to play. He's got a tough matchup against Chicago next week, though. And then some other guys I want to talk who maybe dropped but have a nice matchup next week. Purdy. And I know Purdy finished well this season, but he struggled in this game with interceptions, and people may be eager to move on with him from that. But next week he gets Dallas, which has been a sieve on defense the past several weeks. And then Bo Nix has a nice matchup as well. Struggled in this game, but for this upcoming week he gets Carolina, which you saw what Marcus Mariota just did. So like that matchup, those are 2 guys that you could pick up. They're probably out there. And then keep an eye on Tua. He is going to be a great guy to pick up as well. That is likely out there in your league too. All right, so drop candidates. I already talked about Mahomes. Don't really need to go too much more into that. Anthony Richardson, man, if you're in a 1 quarterback league, I don't think you can roster this guy anymore. 2 quarterback, I think you got to make some difficult decisions potentially on who's out there. But yeah, he's best. If you could flip him for anything, I would recommend trying to do that. And then Daniel Jones had some good performances for a while, but I think you could safely cut him now, especially there's going to be some rumors with Drew Lock potentially coming in, I imagine, with how he played today. Do hold on Justin Fields. I wouldn't recommend dropping him because this is being recorded during the Steelers-Jets game, but right now Russell Wilson, there's about a couple minutes before halftime, but Russell Wilson not looking good. I wouldn't be surprised if they go back to Justin Fields next week. Better for the team, better for fantasy, better for everybody, except Ciara. All right, buy candidates among the quarterbacks. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to talk some quarterbacks that I like that you could buy off of these performances that were not good from this week, but I'm also going to do a preview into the playoff schedule of good matchups. So ones that I like to buy from this week, CJ Stroud played really bad today, but I do think that this Green Bay defense is better than we give it credit for. There's going to be games where Stroud gets back on some good matchups. He's got Jacksonville again. He's got the Colts again. He's going to have some good opportunities. And I believe even this next week, he's got a good matchup as well. He's got the Colts next week. And then he gets Dallas in a few weeks, and then he gets Tennessee. So all that sets up well to CJ Stroud potentially being a good buy low candidate for you. Joe Burrow, I think, is if you're going to take advantage of an opportunity to buy him, then maybe this could be it off of a semi-poor performance where he ranked outside the top 10. And then Brock Purdy, I think based on the way he finished this game, you can't really buy low on him right now, but I do think he is a good quarterback that's dependable. One of my leagues, I traded Anthony Richardson for Brock Purdy, and that worked out pretty well for me. So just a lot of people do not have as good of opinion of him as you may think, despite what the numbers say. But the playoff schedules that are very good for quarterbacks for week 15, 16, and 17 in your fantasy playoffs, the Dallas Cowboys, Carolina Panthers, New York Giants, Chicago Bears, and Philadelphia Eagles. Those are the top 5 matchups. So you're looking at quarterbacks like Jalen Hurts, potentially a good buy low candidate. Probably can't buy low now, but I've been saying to buy low on him until he ended up having the number 1 quarterback performance on the week. Caleb Williams, another reason why you should invest in him. Dak Prescott, maybe he's been dropped. He could be a good candidate to stash or to pick up on his bye week, especially if you don't need to depend on him right now. Wouldn't go as far as saying the Panthers and Giants quarterbacks, though. All right, sell candidates. So we've had 2 good weeks of Trevor Lawrence in a row. Don't think that we're going to see many of that, so I would sell him. And then Sam Darnold, relative to the rest of the quarterback performances, he was okay today. But I do think that this is a guy that we've seen good numbers to start the season, and then things have looked a little more shaky lately. So he's especially you're looking at their fantasy playoffs. You got Chicago, Seattle, and Green Bay in their playoffs, which are all solid defenses. He's got Chicago twice, so remaining on his schedule. So I think that he's somebody that you could potentially look to flip for another quarterback. And then I want to bring up Drake Maye as well, because if you're in a 2 quarterback league, Maye's started off with a 19 and a 20-point game to start his career. Maybe somebody will buy into that, and you could flip him for something that could be more consistent for you, because he's not going to continue at a pace like this throughout the season. I could assure you of that. The toughest schedules for quarterbacks are Buffalo, New England, and that's another reason why you should sell Drake Maye, Miami, Denver, and Cincinnati. So the quarterbacks that I'm looking at this that you would want to sell, like Joe Burrow and Josh Allen, I don't think you can sell those guys despite those tough matchups in the playoffs. Those guys usually turn it up in the playoffs anyway, historically throughout their career. I mean, fantasy playoffs, not NFL playoffs. Tua potentially is a trade candidate, but I don't think you can get really enough value out of Bo Nix to potentially trade him for something that you would get positive value for. Running backs. So the running backs for this week, there weren't really a lot of guys that stood out among the running backs that weren't already rostered. The one guy that I would say to check if he's out there is Tank Bigsby, because he may have been dropped in a lot of leagues. Same goes with Kareem Hunt. Maybe he was dropped during the bye week or with whatever fear that they had of Clyde Edwards-Helaire coming back into the lineup. Both those guys could still be out there, so take a look for them. But the biggest thing from this week of the guys that I'm looking to roster are the handcuffs that are applicable to your team. But before I get into that, some guys that stood out to me among the fringe players that could be in the flex range. Tyler Goodson, who I talked about in my last video, good candidate to get more snaps as the season progresses. Alexander Mattison had a solid game for the Raiders. He's going to be their featured back moving forward. I would imagine he's got some good pass catching ability. I think he'll be a safe play throughout the season. And then Ray Davis, which kind of starts into my categories of the handcuffs that I'd be looking to pick up. If you own, I think the move with running backs right now is to get the handcuff of whatever elite running back you have. So if you own Breece Hall, you want to get Braylon Allen. If you own James Cook, you want to get Ray Davis. If you have Aaron Jones, you want to get Ty Chandler. If you have, Jordan Mason, Isaac Garendo, maybe not necessarily you want to go there, but some other guys like that are doing extremely well, you want to make sure that you have their handcuff. So Barkley owners, you want to make sure you get Gainwell. Derrick Henry, you want to have Justice Hill, guys like that. I think that's the move to make, because there's not really a lot of guys that really stood out from this week that did well that weren't already heavily rostered. Not really chasing guys like JaMychal Hasty off of this week or Dearness Johnson necessarily, because I think when Etienne comes back, Johnson is going to go bye-bye. Drop candidates, Trey Sermon, lost his work to Tyler Goodson, which I predicted was going to happen. Zamir White got involved a little bit at the end of the game, but he's clearly lost his job to Mattison. Audric Estime, this is more getting into deeper leagues now for those Denver truthers who were thinking that he could get more opportunity. The other Cleveland running backs, aside from Chubb, can all be dropped. And then Zack Moss, who I talked about earlier. Who are the buy candidates among running backs? So I'm going to start with Devon Achane. Tua is supposed to come back in week 8. And Achane, I think, is a great buy candidate because this Miami offense has struggled. But in the 2 games that Tua was there, this guy was a top 5 fantasy running back. He had 15 carries for 77 yards today. So you like the fact that he's getting the majority of the carries in this backfield. The quarterback play is obviously limiting the whole team. But when Tua gets back, I foresee that this will be a much better situation for him. And he has a great playoff schedule, which I will talk shortly. Kyren Williams. Amazingly, Kyren Williams scores a lot of touchdowns, but he doesn't get the yardage that necessarily gives you good fantasy numbers necessarily relative to the other guys. But if you're looking for a consistent fantasy running back, you can't really go any worse than this. Kyren Williams throughout the season has scored 14, 15, 31, 20, 15, 19. So that's, every game is over 14 points. Great numbers for you. He gets touchdowns every game. Really like Kyren Williams as a buy candidate for you. Now we go into more of the fringe guys as well. So Nick Chubb got the majority of the touches today. I didn't recommend starting him, and he wouldn't really have given you great numbers if you did play him, but he did get the majority of carries on this team. And now the hope is that with a new quarterback, maybe they can expand this offense a little more. So maybe they get Baltimore next week, tough defense. But I think that they're going to try to feature Nick Chubb more, and he should be a solid fringe flex player for you. Chase Brown is my number 1 buy, though, among these mid-tier running backs because he has taken the backfield from Zack Moss. He's going to continue to get more involved. He didn't have a good game today, but Cincinnati is going to rely on him throughout the season, and I think that this will be a great buy low candidate for you. And then Tyrone Tracy is a relative buy as well. Coming off a bad game, he may be dropped in some leagues, but to me, he's going to eventually much like in Cincinnati, they're going to eventually give this backfield to the younger, more explosive running back, and that's Tyrone Tracy Jr. I'd be trying to make sure he's stashed in any league that you have. The playoff schedules for running backs that look the best, and even this is even why you should invest in Tracy more, is because the Giants have the number one playoff schedule for running backs remaining this season. Then the Miami Dolphins, another reason to invest in Achane. Then the Rams, another reason to invest in Kyron. So those are your top three right there. And then Tennessee and New England, not really as much interested in those guys that you would want to have for the playoff schedule. But for the fantasy playoffs, Giants, Dolphins, and Rams all look very good. Sell candidates, though. So I'm going to do this one as a caveat. Jahmir Gibbs is a good sell candidate off of this game if you are getting an elite running back. And I'm talking like a Derrick Henry, a Saquon Barkley, a Breece Hall. Because Gibbs, great game today, but ultimately, more often than not, we're not going to see games like this because his value is always going to be capped with David Montgomery. They're going to share the backfield. There's going to be some, consistent performances that you can rely upon, but nothing that's really going to be elite for the majority of the season. So if you could trade that off of this game for somebody like a Derrick Henry, let's say if he doesn't do well on Monday night, I would do that. But that being said, I would only make a trade to give Gibbs to somebody if you were getting elite return. Similarly, another sell candidate to look at is Alvin Kamara. Currently, Kamara is the number one running back in fantasy right now based on his numbers because he started off crazy to begin the season. But with this Saints offense struggling, his performance has continued to dwindle. He only had 10 rushing yards last week. You may have lost your window to try to sell high on him necessarily, but you're selling off the fact that he's the number one running back fantasy-wise because his performance since week 3 when they had the offensive line injuries, he's only had one game over 20 points. And then since Derek Carr has been out, it's been even worse. It's been 26 rushing yards, 40 rushing yards, and 10 rushing yards the last 3 weeks. So this is a good opportunity to try to sell Kamara for because I do feel that he's not going to get back to that elite level that we saw in week 2. Other guys to look at, you could try to sell Kareem Hunt because if and when Pacheco comes back, it's probably going to be some more limited touches for him, I would imagine. Clyde Edwards-Helaire could get more adjusted as well. So Kareem Hunt, this could be good to sell him off a game like this. And then J.K. Dobbins as well, because they have the hardest schedule, which is what I'm going to talk now. The hardest schedule for running backs is Los Angeles Chargers, Cincinnati Bengals, Kansas City Chiefs, Indianapolis Colts, and Las Vegas Raiders. So Dobbins, with his injury history, with the playoff schedule that they have in their fantasy playoff slate, this is a good time to potentially flip him as well. All right, wide receivers to pick up for this week. So the ones that I'm looking at are the ones from San Francisco because Ricky Pearsall would be number one for me, and then Jawan Jennings, because Jennings is dealing with an injury. Pearsall is just getting integrated into this team. And these are both guys that I would not necessarily want to play for this week, but they're guys that I'm interested in depending on what happens with Ayuik and Debo rest of the way. This is still, I believe, a good offense. They had a tough matchup today, and these are two sleeper receivers that could get more involved that are likely out there. Pay attention to those Cleveland receivers too. I'm not really as interested in them, but Cedric Tillman and Elijah Moore are. So Tillman had the one who had the great game today, and I think we were all thinking it'd be Jerry Jeudy, but these are two guys that you want to take a look at, Tillman and Moore. Probably more valuable to pick them up and try to flip them off this week, which is valuable. See what you can get in them in a trade, but they're worth monitoring to see what happens. So I wouldn't be starting them in week 8, but I would be trying to stash it and see what develops. Romeo Doubs, I would be interested in starting this next week because they get Jacksonville. And I think if you need somebody to start for this week, check if Romeo Doubs is out there. I think that would be a great play for you to look at. Same thing with Dontavian Wicks if you do get that as well. Take a look at Troy Franklin of the Denver Broncos. He's starting to get more target involvement. Courtland Sutton was kind of shut out in this past game by Lattimore, but Franklin has been getting more involved the past few weeks. Previous relationship with Bo Nix at the University of Oregon. He could be a great second half sleeper in your fantasy teams. And then I was wrong about Demario Douglas. I was looking forward to this game, but apparently they didn't disclose that he was sick. So that would have changed things if you had let us know before the game started that he was dealing with an illness, but I don't know. Gerard Mayo kind of screwed us all in that game. But I still think that he's got a lot of upside moving forward with this team. He got involved early in the game, and then I guess he just wasn't feeling it. But right out of the gates, he had 2 receptions, and then I guess his sickness got the best of him. And then stash guy to keep an eye out for. But if you have a good roster and you can afford to hold this player, Calvin Ridley has had 9 and 8 targets the past 2 weeks. So you can see what happens there. I'm not expecting much, but theoretically he is their number 1 receiver. And maybe with Mason Rudolph, you can get him a little more involved throughout the season. Drop candidates. So the 2 Jaguars are both droppable to me, both Christian Kirk and Gabe Davis. Gabe Davis, I knew this was going to happen where he was going to have a dud to follow up last week's 20-point plus game. Ray McLeod is a potential drop candidate as well in the deeper league formats. He's kind of ceded his role to the other Falcons receivers. Darius Slayton fell off in this game after a valiant effort for a few weeks while Neighbors was out. Now Neighbors is back. We can't really rely on Darius Slayton. And then shallow leagues. What do you do with this player? Tank Dell. I had high hopes for Tank Dell this season, but following this game, it's going to be tough to trust him rest of the way. He did have a nice game against the Patriots, but it's just not the same as what we saw last year. Maybe there's figure out a way to script him better. Something is going on there, but 4 targets today, no receptions. He's also had he's really only had 1 game that he's been fantasy relevant this season. If you're in a shallow league and you need some other options, I think he's a potential drop guy as well, sadly. Buy candidates for this week. So I'm going to go through the playoff schedules in a sec, but the playoff schedules that are very good are the teams of these 2 players that fall in the elite category, CeeDee Lamb and DJ Moore. They both have great fantasy playoff schedules to end the season. You could also look to get some solid top 15 receivers off of their struggling week 7s, Malik Neighbors and Jaden Reed. I'm not really too worried about those players despite how they played this week. I would be trying to buy both of them. And then mid-tier guys that I would be trying to buy as well based on the opportunity. So we'll see what happens with Xavier Worthy, if he's going to be injured throughout the season. But he did get 8 targets before he went out. He's getting more involved as the season goes along. He's potential buy low, especially with the noted receiver struggles on this team. Demario Douglas, I think, he's probably going to be dropped after this week, but in very deep leagues, I would still be willing to buy him. Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill to a degree. If you have winning records and you can't afford to take on these guys, they are going to have better performances when Tua comes back. But on the flip side, those are both guys that if you have a losing record and you need to start getting some W's, I think you got to move on from them because they're killing you right now if you're relying on them and putting them in your lineup. And then Trey Tucker didn't have a great game today necessarily, but I do think that he is going to, of the receivers on this team, is going to have more of a role moving forward. Brock Bowers is obviously going to be the biggest target generator on the Raiders, but Trey Tucker had 8 targets today. He had 3 for 36. You love the 8 targets, and I think among the receivers, he is their best receiving option moving forward, especially if Myers is going to miss time. And the playoff schedules rest of the way. As I said, the best playoff schedules for receivers are Dallas, Chicago, Green Bay. So why I say to buy Reed, Lamb, and Moore. And then the Giants are number 4. So that's Malik Neighbors. So those 4 guys are all the ones that I'd be looking at, especially based on this playoff record. And then the Philadelphia Eagles also have a nice schedule for receivers. Sell candidates. So Garrett Wilson, for obvious reasons with the introduction of Devontae Adams, I think that you could try to sell him off that game where he had 22 targets against the Vikings in London. But he's going to be losing his target volume to Adams. And I believe I have to, as I said, the game is going on, but Garrett Wilson definitely is not looking as strong, and he's not getting the amount of targets that he had before with Adams or without Adams. So he's a good sell candidate. Chris Godwin, off of the fact that he's the number one wide receiver in fantasy, which if you have Chris Godwin, great. But much like I said with Gibbs, if you're going to trade Godwin, you got to get elite return. You got to get, Malik Neighbors. I think that's a fair deal that somebody with Malik Neighbors may take. You got to get, I think DJ Moore, that's a solid deal as well. Those, I don't know if I was going as far as Jaden Reed, but CeeDee Lamb, Malik Neighbors, and DJ Moore, those are all guys I would trade Godwin or trade with Godwin to get one of those three. Stephon Diggs is a good trade away candidate too. He's in the top 10 for receivers, but when Nico Collins comes back, I think he will be expendable. Allen Lazard is a top 11 fantasy receiver. Hard to believe, but I think if you can flip him for anything, I would recommend doing that. Not anything, but just comparable receivers that will be getting more involved in the offense, because Lazard could be the third receiver. And then some fringe guys that are good sell candidates. Darnell Mooney, good sell candidate off of the fact that he's a top 20 receiver. His numbers have been going down. He's had some blow-up games. You could try to flip him. Deontay Johnson, the Panthers' offense is crashing back down to earth, and Deontay Johnson, he relies on that volume from Andy Dalton, but if he's not performing well, then they go back to Bryce Young potentially. It just complicates things again, and you see what we had the first 2 weeks. So it may be time to try to trade him, although you're not really trading high. And then Devontae Smith, I would say the same thing, because he is not going to get enough target volume to, in comparison to AJ Brown and Saquon, that's going to justify the position that you draft him. So maybe selling those guys for 75 cents on the dollar, but it may be worth it. The toughest matchups for wide receivers are Kansas City, Miami, Los Angeles Chargers, New England, and Denver. So players that stand out among that group, the Miami receivers, that could be tough for them, especially given the fact that they've already been struggling. But I do think that they're good buy candidates if you have a winning record, especially Hill. And then Denver's wide receivers, Cortland Sutton, that could be a tough situation for him as well, given that playoff schedule. All right, tight ends for this week. So Hunter Henry got a large target volume from Drake Maye. This is somebody that I'm very interested in for long term. I think among the tight ends that are lightly rostered, this would probably be my number one. Hunter Henry is not always the most reliable, but based on what we saw through 2 weeks with Drake Maye, I think there could be something here. And if you're in a position where you need a consistent tight end, this one may be worth it. Jonnu Smith. This is somebody I've talked about this season that could be underrated. If Tyler Huntley or Tim Boyle or whoever is going to be their quarterback other than Tua is still in, this is maybe the only Dolphin that I would consider starting for this next week, because, 7 targets today, 7 for 96 and 1. That's pretty good. Finished in the top 5 among tight ends. I believe the number 2 actually this week. But it remains to be seen what that looks like with Tua. But if it looks like they're going to be using backups again, this is a solid stream option for you. You have the other guys that are Zach Ertz and Noah Fant, who I've talked about too, are consistent streaming options that you can look at. But in deep leagues, if you want to try to hit a home runs, look at Jatavion Sanders. I talked about him in my last video. Starting to get more involved, and we see more involvement even this week. This week, as I've said, he had 5 targets and then 7 targets in week 5 and 6. Today, he had 6 for 61 and 6. He had a nice catch down the middle of the field as well for them. It's kind of like a jump ball, high pointing type of play. But I think that he could be a thing moving forward for this team in fantasy. And in deep leagues, it may be worth picking. If let's say you own LaPorta, it may be worth picking up Sanders and see how that develops. Maybe you can flip LaPorta for another position that could be comparable, and it may not be a bad situation for you. Drop candidates. So Isaiah Likely is droppable. Mark Andrews is droppable. I'm staying away from that Ravens tight end situation. And then if you're in deep leagues, Gesicki has not been good for a couple weeks. Theo Johnson, as I said, much like Sanders, he's somebody to keep an eye on because his target volume has been going up. But he follows it up today with a terrible performance, so you can kind of end that experiment. Buy candidates. So at this point, I would be looking to buy the tight ends that are getting the most volume. So who are those guys? The ones that stand out to me are David Njoku and Evan Ingram. You may have noticed in the intro I talked about Njoku with the Amari Cooper trade that he is going to be the biggest benefactor. And look what happened. Number one tight end on the week. He had 14 targets, 10 receptions, 76 yards and a touchdown. This is what I'm talking about for David Njoku owners. This guy, he's going to be a sleeper the rest of the season if we see more like this. They don't have a consistent wide receiver on that team. David Njoku is their best receiver. Imagine this is a Brock Bowers light. And speaking of Brock Bowers, number one fantasy playoff schedule is the Las Vegas Raiders. So you're already rolling in the deep if you got Brock Bowers as your tight end in fantasy. Well, congratulations, because you have the best playoff schedule for among tight ends. You've also got Kansas City, so for those Travis Kelce owners, could be a good situation to buy low off of a bad game like this. Cleveland, number 3, David Njoku. Denver Broncos, and Atlanta Falcons. So those are the best playoff schedules. Other guys that I will say to keep an eye out for as well that you should try to buy is Evan Ingram. I like him, but as I'm going to talk a little bit, he's got a tough playoff schedule. But he does figure to get some volume, which I do like among these tight ends. So these guys that I'm trying to sell at this point are the ones that are not getting volume. And as I already talked about with Sam LaPorta, you're not seeing the volume consistency. And at this point, I'm really not thinking it's going to be there. Another player that I think this is a good opportunity to try to sell high off of a solid game, but nothing spectacular, is Dalton Kincaid. He did okay today. He had, the case for him is he has been getting some target involvement on this team, 7-6, 7-6 over the past few weeks. But with Amari Cooper getting more comfortable in the system, and just involvement of Keon Coleman, who looked good in this game, I think that we're going to see a situation where Kincaid is going to lose his touches throughout the season, and he could be a good sell candidate off of a game where he was serviceable. And then Tucker Kraft potentially is a sell candidate if you can get a David Njoku or an Evan Ingram, because he had an okay game today, but he didn't get a lot of targets. He had his numbers kind of inflated, I believe, by a touchdown. Yeah, he had a touchdown, 3 for 33 of 4. Doesn't look great necessarily for his target count. And Green Bay's got so many receiving options that I think it's going to be hard for him to ever replicate his 2-touchdown game against the Rams from 2 weeks ago. I would try to sell him off that sooner rather than later. The toughest matchups for defenses. So Buffalo's got the toughest matchup. Another reason to try to sell Dalton Kincaid. And then other tough matchups are Houston, Indianapolis, Miami, and Jacksonville. Those teams all have the toughest fantasy playoff schedule among the tight end position. All right, so we'll close things out talking defense and kickers. Good defensive matchups for this week. I want to talk the number 2 defense, Washington. They get Chicago next week. I wouldn't go as far as to play them this next week, but it is conceivable that they could have a good matchup against Chicago. But yeah, maybe in deep leagues. But the best matchup this week is Detroit against Tennessee. Maybe they were dropped because of the fear against them going up against the Vikings. So that's the number 1 I would look at. Kansas City against Las Vegas, still out there in a lot of leagues. Los Angeles Chargers play New Orleans next week. Should be a great matchup as long as Derek Carr is still out. And then Green Bay, which is a solid defense, gets Jacksonville, which should be a good matchup there. So those are all defenses that I like for this upcoming week 8. Kickers. Austin Seibert has still been just crushing it at the kicker position. So if he is out there, he's a must roster to me among the kickers. Should be top 5 by the end of this week, despite missing week 1. Will Lutz had a great game this past week, and I think this upcoming matchup for Denver against Carolina, Denver, I could see them scoring a lot of points, could set up well for Will Lutz, but don't have the receivers quite like Washington, so maybe that could mean a lot of field goals. See if Jake Moody is out there. He was probably cut from a lot of rosters with his injuries, but he should be back next week against Dallas, which for San Francisco should be a lot more points. And then Cameron Dicker has been pretty good the last few weeks since their bye, and he gets New Orleans this next week, which Will Lutz, number 1 kicker, just played New Orleans. So that's all we've got for this video today. Like I said earlier, please comment if you have any questions about your fantasy football rosters that you want answered for this week. Like I said, I reply to all my commenters, and I want to help you guys win a fantasy football championship. So enjoy the rest of your week 7, and we'll see you all next time.